In the spring of 2006, two experienced cavers attempted to complete a 7-mile journey through Simmons-Mingo Cave in West Virginia. The cave ended up being too massive, so they left early after only getting around halfway through the underground maze. A year later, they convinced 3 friends to try spelunking for the first time in Simmons-Mingo. Despite not finishing the cave the first time, the cavers felt confident they'd make it through. But this time, they couldn't find the way back and got lost for days. Did hope run out for this team of young adult cavers? Or did rescuers manage to save them from their grim fate? Find out as we explore the story of the Simmons-Mingo Cave Rescue. 25-year-old Dan Sampson and 20-year-old Sky Fisher were the 2 members of the group with the most caving experience. They were joined by Sky's fiancée, 21-year-old Carrie Krall, 20-year-old Heidi McWilliams, and 30-year-old Jason Ross. Based on Dan and Sky's previous trip, the team planned for a 10-hour journey through Simmons-Mingo. They were in good spirits and planned to get through the cave in a single day. Since they had experienced cavers with them, they all brought decent gear, including helmets, headlamps, extra lights, food, water, backpacks, and other gear. Only one member skipped coveralls. They had rugged clothes that could protect them from the mud and sharp rocks inside the cave, and they had some level 2 extreme cold weather clothing gear. However, they weren't fully equipped with this thermal protective gear, so they were still susceptible to the cold. They grabbed their gear and drove to the cave in 2 groups. They each parked near different exits before meeting up at the designated entry point. The cavers were supposed to visit a nearby house to check with the owner of the property before descending into the cave. The owner had a logbook that cavers could use to record what time they entered. The logbook could be handy because if something went wrong, rescuers or search parties could check the names to contact families and determine how urgent or dire their situation was based on how long they had been missing. If they had only been inside for a few hours, then they could start the search with only a few people. But if they'd been gone long, they'd need to search the area and bring more people to cover ground as fast as possible. Cavers often park near this house by the cave, which can be difficult, and sometimes cars get stuck in the ditch. Since they parked in different locations, half the team couldn't sign the logbook. If explorers start on one end of the cave where the route is easy, the owners will occasionally let people go without signing the logbook. But the other side is harder, and the owners require people attempting the harder route to sign the book just to be safe. The other half of this team either neglected to tell the owners they'd be delving deep below ground, or they may have informed the owners without signing the logbook. They felt safer since they'd told their families, and they weren't supposed to attempt the hard route. Simmons-Mingo Cave is located 130 miles east of Charleston, West Virginia, below the Mingo Knob mountain peak, which towers 4,121 feet above the forest. The cave is 718 feet deep with 7 miles of mapped passages. There are various entry points to the cave accessible via the nearby Oil Drum Falls and Elk River Valley camping areas. There's the Oil Drum Falls entrance, which was close to where the second group parked, and multiple entrances close to each other by the Simmons house. One of the most common entrances is called Satan's Blowing Rock, which is a hole covered by an old washing machine lid. Underneath, the air from the cave rises into the face of cavers as they stare into the abyss. The historic entry is another route they could have taken, but they plan to go through the most common entrance near Satan's Blowing Rock, which would exit through the historic entrance. The most popular entrance to Simmons-Mingo recently had a cave-in, making it harder to see. Some cavers have missed the main entrance, causing them to take harder routes through the arduous cave. The ground came to a lip before descending into a muddy slope into the rock. Just past the mud, the cave opened with the chimney chute. Cavers can slide down the tube, being mindful not to gain too much speed while keeping enough distance to avoid crashing into each other, which could cause a chain reaction. Carrie Krall, Sky Fisher, Jason Ross, Dan Sampson, and Heidi McWilliams entered Simmons-Mingo Cave on Saturday, April 21, 2007. The group was later unsure what time they entered. Some thought they've entered inside during midday, while others thought they entered in the early morning. Since it was a 10-hour ordeal, it would have been important for them to enter as early as possible. If they left later in the day, they would have less energy to complete the cave. And if something went wrong, their families would be forced to stay up late to call for help. Otherwise, rescuers might not be informed until morning. A delay like that could cost them their lives because the first 24 hours after an incident are the most crucial. If missing people aren't located in that time window, they likely won't be found alive. At the bottom of the chimney chute, there's a large room with a massive pit and another slippery ramp around it. To cross the dangerous pit, they had to carefully shuffle across another slippery mud bridge, with death on either side. This area connected to the entrance below the washing machine lid, and a structure called Eggeter's Dome loomed overhead. Through a small hole, the team reached some breakdown rooms where the ceiling had crumbled away, forming massive walls of rubble. A very long and uncomfortable crawl led to an area with multiple ropes and a room with layers of cliffs. A few passages were lined with some boulders that had broken from the ceiling above. The first rope was short, and beyond it lay longer ropes that led down to a lake, which wasn't supposed to be there. Little did they know, the three main entrances on what's called the dry branch side of Simmons-Mingo aren't dry passages at all. Further down the cave, there were multiple low points where the cave could flood to form sumps. When they entered the cave, the winter snow had melted, but spring rain had refilled the sumps. Experts knew this was a terrible time to attempt to trip through any portions of the cave that were close to the sumps, and the group was just one wrong turn and one rainstorm away from disaster. The group had stumbled upon the cave's second sump, a cold lake, deep and shadowy, that rose and fell with seasonal rainfall. They climbed up another rope to bypass the sump, and found other cavers had painted some arrows along the cave to help guide explorers along the proper routes. The cavers ventured through a tight squeeze into a room full of white crystals with a cable ladder that was worn from constant use. Next, they reached a landmark called Register Rock. This first section is commonly traversed by cavers, so the rocky floor is worn down, and the pathway is clear and easy to see. Beyond this area, they found the attic room, which extended into increasingly tight and complex passages. Many of these side routes now have tape, signaling passages that contain protected formations, preserved routes, or areas where scientists are working. The taped routes could also indicate dangerous passages, but not all of the routes had been taped at the time of their journey. Sampson and his friends reached a corkscrew passage that was much more difficult than the previous areas. While attempting to traverse this section, Carrie stumbled. Her knee slammed on the stones below, scraping her skin. She twisted as she fell and landed on a rock which impacted her ribs, causing her to roll to her side in pain. She gasped for breath and winced. It was hard to breathe, and her friends feared she had punctured a lung or broken some bones. But after a short time, she was able to hobble on one leg, and her breathing, while pained, returned to a decent rhythm. Her knee was battered, and she could limp for now, while the adrenaline from the accident dulled her pain. They didn't have much longer to go. She just had to endure the last portions of Simmons-Mingo Cave. Near the end of the cave, the group squeezed through an incredibly tight passage. At first, they weren't sure if they could make it. Carrie's ribs were a problem, and she couldn't use her legs to push herself through, but they worked together to get her past the hole, and they all got through. Then, their route led to a massive room with tunnels sprawling all around it. The group went through each passage, but all of them looped back around to the main room. It was exactly like a maze. They were expecting to be done with their journey after 10 hours of caving, but instead, at the 10-hour mark, they found themselves lost and trapped below the ground in Simmons-Mingo Cave. Late at night, the owner of the nearby house noticed that one of the group's cars was still outside, and they called emergency services. Lieutenant Kelly Bastian and 2 rescuers from the Shavers Fork Fire Rescue Squad came to the Simmons-Mingo at 11:15 p.m. They had caving experience, so they immediately entered the cave to search for the group. The rescue team entered one of the cave's exits on the main route and then descended down a large slope that's around 100 feet long. From there, they climbed a 25-foot pit onto a path that's lined with reflectors that fell from the clothing of cavers that came before them. Some reflectors may have been placed there to signal the exit, but either way, the rescuers continued onward. They reached a tiny crack that they were unable to squeeze through, so they explored down a different passage instead. Now, even though rescuers were already on the scene, the group of cavers hadn't realized they were fully stuck yet. Further inside, they thought they were still exploring Simmons-Mingo, although each route ended up taking them back to the same spot. 3 hours after rescuers entered the cave, the group of young cavers realized they were stuck. McWilliams and the rest of the cavers finally stopped to figure out what they should do next. They took an inventory, and they found out they were all out of food. They were all instantly stressed, but they were level-headed. Heidi took a moment to pray. Fisher and Crawl were engaged, and they were supposed to meet with Crawl's parents the next morning at 6 a.m. They thought it would be at least 2 a.m. before their families called for help, which would mean even longer before rescuers got there. But the cave was well mapped, so they thought they had plenty of time for rescuers to find them, and then they could even catch their meeting on time. In reality, rescuers were already on the scene, so the timeline should have been even faster. But this group was about to get very unlucky. After 3 hours underground, the rescuers had to turn back. Part of the cave was unreachable since they couldn't fit through the tight squeeze, and rescue protocol required the team to leave the cave after 3 hours to prevent the rescuers themselves from getting stuck or lost. After an hour to recoup, at 4 a.m., the small band of rescuers re-entered through the same entrance the cavers had used. They hoped the passages near the sumps wouldn't be blocked. They checked down the dark pit near the entrance. They checked the sumps, and while they were flooded, the cave was still passable through other routes. There was no sign of recent flooding, and no rain was expected. Then, they explored deep into the 7-mile labyrinth, but there was no sign of the cavers, and no sounds indicating their presence. The small band of rescuers exited the cave the next morning, and they called in the big guns. They needed all the help they could get. For the next 36 hours, 2 of the non-injured cavers would take turns departing from the central room, where they had set up a bleak campsite. The 2 designated cavers would scout through the tunnels, looking for a way out or for any sign of rescuers. Since they had no technology to communicate, they would yell back and forth to stay oriented. The trapped cavers tried to sleep in shifts. They used their rugged backpacks as pillows, which gave little comfort. They were exhausted, so the scratchy surface of their packs wasn't enough to stop them from getting some shut-eye. However, the climate of the cave was causing them trouble. Temperatures in the cave were around 50 degrees, and even with their gear, their shivering bodies wouldn't let them get any sleep. The group wearily sat, nodding off, passing out for brief milliseconds. Their sleep deprivation could be dangerous when performing their scouting missions, but they kept trying, even though their eyes would play tricks on them in the darkness. They still had some light left, but they had to ration it, so most of the time they were in total darkness. The group ran out of food and water before they even realized how dire their situation was, so their dehydration and hunger caused them pain and frustration as they paced around their stone cage. Luckily, they found puddles of muddy water, or lick drops of water from the ceiling to stay barely alive as the hours turned into days. After the first responders notified the cavers' families, 2 nearby family members joined them. The 2 relatives ventured into Simmons-Mingo before more rescuers could arrive, and, frighteningly, they ended up getting lost too. Outside the cave, the Valley Head Volunteer Fire Chief Randall Ware took over as the coordinator for the rescue operations above ground. He called additional backup from the National Cave Rescue Commission and 4 nearby states. Along with his direct requests, the Red Cross, Salvation Army, and the state police all arrived to scour Simmons-Mingo for any sign of Krall, Fisher, or the other lost cavers. Luckily, once teams of cavers began searching the cave from every angle, they quickly located the 2 lost relatives, so they could focus their efforts on the lost team. Rescuers still had no way of knowing what happened to them, so they prepared for every possible situation. They had paramedics inside the cave in case they were injured, they had investigators standing by in case it was a crime scene, and they used wired radios so each rescue team had constant contact with one another. Over 120 volunteers descended onto the peaceful forest by Mingo's Knob to risk their lives to save the cavers. Nearly 3 days after they got lost, Ross and Fisher left on another scouting mission. The other 3 sat in silence, which was only broken by the sound of Carrie wincing in pain. As the silence of the cave dragged on, an uncomfortable feeling crept over Sampson, McWilliams, and Krall. An hour went by, and they hadn't heard their friends call to them from beyond the maze. They tried to reassure each other. Surely they hadn't been gone that long. It just felt like a long time because the cave was playing tricks on them. But no, they were gone for over 2 hours. Then, 6 hours after Ross and Fisher left, the remaining 3 cavers started to lose hope. Carrie was already injured. And now her fiancé, Skylar, was gone. They were already exhausted, worn thin, tired, thirsty, and freezing. Now their friends were missing, or possibly even dead. The 3 trapped cavers had a talk that sent ice through their veins, even colder than the air of the abyss. They had a talk no one should have to have. They said, "We're done for." And they discussed how they should come to terms with their own imminent deaths. 10 minutes after that morbid conversation, they heard a name in the distance. 8 hours after the pair went to scout, they reemerged from the shadows and hugged it out with their friends. They were just as scared as the 3 who were still at the maze's hub. The cavers were still trapped and fighting for their lives, but at least they were together again. The lost cavers were feeling the air get thinner and thinner as they slowly burned through all of the available oxygen in the chamber. They breathed hard in their cold, dark tomb. Their minds were beyond tired, and their bodies were tired, hungry, freezing, and racked with pain. Heidi held hands with 2 of her friends and prayed once more. This time, as they sobbed the final words of their prayer, like something straight out of a movie, they heard a voice. It was distant and unfamiliar. Could it be rescuers? Salvation from this hell? Heidi later said she fell to the floor after hearing the voice. The pain of her knees impacting the stone floor didn't bother her at all. She wept. Her tears stung her cracked and dry skin. But she wasn't happy. None of them were. They were distraught and terrified. They thought they were losing their minds or hearing hallucinations, ghostly phantoms calling them into eternal darkness. But soon, the voices got louder, and faint light pierced the endless shadow. Then they knew they weren't going crazy. Heidi's prayers were answered. Her friends were saved. After several attempts to find the lost cavers, rescue teams finally located them at 11:30 a.m. on Monday. But even though help had arrived, they were still in for a long haul. Before exiting the cave, rescuers took time to rehydrate and feed the victims. They brought typical caving food like granola bars and water, but they also had some sports drinks that provided much-needed electrolytes, which was important because just a small imbalance of minerals like potassium can impact the heartbeat, leading to a heart attack or cardiac arrest. Some of the group were escorted out without much trouble, but Carrie was struggling with her injuries after her fall in the corkscrew chamber. After paramedics assessed her condition, they found she had bruised ribs and she had damaged her knee. No life-threatening injuries, but she wasn't leaving the cave without help. The rescue team didn't need to go through the full effort of rigging the whole cave to extract her, but they did use ropes and stretchers to get through any vertical or inclined climbing sections. The final section of Simmons-Mingo required some climbing, but rescuers attached a haul line and a seat harness to help all of them up the ledge. The harness was replaced with a stretcher for carry. All of the cavers were treated for hypothermia on the surface. Rescuers prepared for the worst, so a helicopter was standing by. Once Carrie made it to the forest above ground, the medical chopper flew her to Ruby Memorial Hospital in the nearby Morgantown. Some sources say the rest were taken by road to a hospital in Elkins to recover from exposure to the cold and to rehydrate. Others say they were treated at the scene. Another pair of rescuers were sent into the cave to recover the team's gear. These two cavers had to carry 7 bags between the two of them, which hindered their progress. It took until 4:30 p.m. on Monday for them to exit the cave. But once these last 2 rescuers exited the cave, the rescue mission was complete. Including the time it took for rescuers to extract them from the cave, they had been underground for over 50 hours. It turns out the first rescuers had turned around just a short distance before where the lost cavers were eventually found. The cavers were so close to the exit when they got trapped. They were only 1,500 feet away from finishing their journey without a hitch. That tight squeeze near the exit is where everything went wrong. If the group ignored that hole, they could have made it out safely. And since the first rescuers couldn't access it, later teams didn't put a priority on that area either. When the cavers were ready to leave either the hospital or the rescue scene, their families came together and they all went to Pizza Hut to celebrate their mostly safe return. Ross was asked if he would give up the hobby after his brush with death, but he told reporters he'd been caving for 10 years, and instead of quitting, he felt determined to correct his mistake and learn from it. That's the story of 5 cavers who barely made it out of Simmons-Mingo Cave after getting stuck in a maze just off the beaten path. Their experience, or lack thereof, led them to a grim conclusion. They might really die here. They struggled to come to terms with their fate, but in the end, they kept their cool, fought for survival, and came out of their stony prison alive and ready to go caving another day. Would you avoid panicking if you were trapped in a cave hundreds of feet below ground, or would you freak out? Share your thoughts with us in the comment section below. Like the video if you think these 5 cavers showed bravery in the face of death, and make sure to subscribe to the channel to hear more heart-pounding tales.